Brielle Sinclair walked down the aisle wearing her sister's veil. Not a veil like it. Not inspired by it. The actual veil hand-sewn by their grandmother 40 years ago, pearl by pearl, kept in a cedar box that only Amara had the key to open. Amara sat in the second row and watched it happen. She didn't move, didn't speak, kept both hands flat on her knees the way she'd learned to do in board meetings when someone said something that made her want to break a table in half. The chapel smelled like her orchids. The musicians were playing the processional she'd chosen. The flowers at the end of every pew were arranged exactly the way she'd sketched them 8 months ago, in a notebook she still hadn't thrown away. 3 months earlier, Gavin Mercer had disappeared 2 days before their wedding and taken her sister with him. And now Amara was watching them get married inside the wreckage of everything he'd stolen. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who expected you to be grateful for your own humiliation, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a woman finally stops being grateful. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, I bring you stories that will make you feel something real. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone who should have protected you, hit that like button. Let's begin. Amara had not wanted to come. She'd said that clearly, directly, without drama, standing in her parents' kitchen 3 weeks before the ceremony, when her mother first raised the subject. She'd been holding a coffee mug she'd had since college, the one with the chipped handle she kept meaning to replace, and she'd set it down on the counter and said, "I'm not going." Her mother had looked at her the way she always looked at Amara when Amara said something inconvenient, not angry exactly, more like disappointed that Amara was making things complicated. People will talk. People are already talking. They'll say you're bitter. Amara had picked up her coffee mug again. "I am bitter, Mom." That's a completely reasonable response to what happened. Her father had been quieter about it, which was somehow worse. He sat at Tsutsuma with his hands folded and explained that the Sinclair family had a reputation in Chicago that had taken 3 generations to build, that Brielle was still their daughter, regardless of what she'd done, and that Amara attending would demonstrate grace and maturity. Amara had looked at her father for a long time. "You're asking me to demonstrate grace at the wedding my fiancé is throwing with my sister, using my chapel reservation, my flowers, my musicians, and the venue I booked through my own charitable trust." Her father hadn't answered that directly. He'd said, "We're asking you not to make this harder than it already is." She'd gone, not because they convinced her. She'd gone because 23 years of being the dependable one, the responsible one, the daughter who absorbed every family crisis without complaint, had carved grooves into her so deep that even now, even after everything, her instinct was to hold still and manage. She was 32 years old and still hadn't learned how to stop managing. The chapel had been her first mistake. She'd understood that the moment she walked in and recognized every single detail, the ivory ribbon wound around the end of every pew, the cascading arrangements of white dendrobium orchids she'd spent 6 weeks selecting, the quartet playing Sati in the corner. She'd stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds before anyone noticed her, and in those 3 seconds, she'd done a very precise accounting of the cost of what she was looking at. Not in dollars, in months, 8 months of her life. 8 months of meetings, phone calls, tastings, fittings, arguments with vendors, nights awake with her planner open, wondering if she was forgetting something. 8 months of building something she believed would be the beginning of her real life. And Gavin had handed all of it to her sister. She'd found her seat. Second row, left side, exactly where you'd put a family member who was present out of obligation rather than celebration. She'd folded her hands in her lap and looked forward. A woman sat beside her, a colleague of Gavin's. Someone Amara barely recognized had leaned over and whispered, "It's so lovely that you came. Very mature of you." Amara had smiled, the kind of smile that takes muscle control to maintain. Then Brielle had appeared at the back of the chapel, and Amara had seen the veil. For a moment she genuinely didn't process it. Her brain offered several alternative explanations in rapid succession, similar style, same designer, a coincidence, an imitation. But the brain will only protect you for so long from something it already knows, and Amara's brain had cataloged every thread of that veil since she was 7 years old. Since the afternoon, their grandmother sat them both down and explained that it would go to Amara, because Amara was the eldest, and the eldest carried things forward. The pearl work at the left corner was uneven in exactly one place, where their grandmother's hands had begun to shake. Amara had never told anyone about that imperfection. She'd always thought of it as the truest part of the veil evidence of a real person making a real thing, not a perfect object, but an honest one. She could see the imperfection from 12 rows back. Brielle walked forward on their father's arm, their father who had called Amara this morning to remind her to be gracious. Their father who was now walking Brielle toward the altar, wearing Amara's veil. Amara watched his face and tried to determine whether he understood what was on his younger daughter's head, whether he'd noticed, whether he'd said anything. His expression gave her nothing. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. She looked forward. At the altar, Gavin Mercer stood with his jaw set at the particular angle he always adopted when he was performing confidence he didn't quite feel. Amara knew that jaw angle. She'd watched it across dinner tables and boardroom presentations for 3 years. She'd once found it reassuring. It meant he was trying. Now it just meant he'd decided how this moment was supposed to go, and he was daring the room to disagree. Beside him stood Kang Jae-hyun. Amara had not been able to figure out why Jae-hyun was there. That question had been bothering her since she'd received the wedding invitation, which itself had been a particular kind of cruelty, delivered in an envelope with her own handwriting on it because Brielle had apparently helped herself to Amara's address book along with everything else. Jae-hyun's presence as best man made no sense. He and Gavin had a business relationship, thin and transactional, nothing that should have translated into standing at an altar together. Jae-hyun didn't do ceremonial. In 6 years of knowing him, Amara had never seen him at an event he didn't need to be at. She'd told herself she was thinking about this too much. She'd told herself a lot of things. Jae-hyun was 40 years old and had the kind of stillness that made rooms aware of themselves. Not tall in any dramatic way, not obviously intimidating, he simply occupied space, with a precision that suggested nothing in his body moved without a reason. He'd built Mujin Pacific Holdings into one of the most influential shipping conglomerates on the Great Lakes in 12 years, which was the version of him that appeared in business publications. The other version of him appeared in conversations spoken quietly, behind closed doors in a city that had certain arrangements that kept it running. Amara had met him 6 years ago over a pediatric housing program that was collapsing. She'd been trying to prevent a funding gap from shutting down transitional housing for 47 families with children in long-term medical care. She was in a conference room at 11 at night with 3 spreadsheets open and a cold cup of coffee, and a foundation contact had said there was someone who wanted to discuss the program. She'd expected a donor. She'd gotten Kang Jae-hyun, who had sat across from her, read through her program documents without speaking for 9 minutes, and then asked 4 questions so specific and well-constructed that she'd revised her entire board presentation based on them. He hadn't donated. He'd done something more valuable. He'd connected her to 3 city council members who'd been blocking a zoning variance she needed. Within 6 weeks, the program had its housing. She'd called to thank him. He'd said, "You did the work. I just moved a few things out of the way." She'd thought about that sentence more than once in the years that followed. Now he was standing at Gavin Mercer's altar, and Amara could not determine what it meant. The ceremony began. The officiant was a man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who clearly believed this was a romantic occasion and had prepared remarks accordingly. He spoke about love as a commitment. He spoke about marriage as partnership. Amara listened to the words and felt them land somewhere sideways, like rain hitting a window present, audible, completely unable to get through. Then Jae-hyun stepped forward. The officiant paused, confused. Gavin's expression shifted from performance to alarm. with a speed that would have been almost amusing under other circumstances. The chapel went very quiet in the specific way that chapels go quiet when something has happened that wasn't in the program. I object 2 words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Jae-hyun said them with the same tone he probably used to decline an unsatisfactory contract, factual, final, faintly bored. Amara stopped breathing. Every head in the chapel turned. Some turned toward Jae-hyun. Most turned toward Amara. She felt the weight of all those stares and understood immediately what they were looking for. They wanted to see her react, wanted to measure her pain, wanted the satisfaction of witnessing whatever emotion this produced. She gave them nothing. She kept her hands flat and her face still and looked at Jae-hyun. He was already looking at her. Gavin found his voice first. The expenses from the Sinclair charitable account designated for a previous ceremony were transferred to fund this one. Jae-hyun was speaking to the room, but his eyes moved between Gavin and Amara with a deliberateness that felt surgical. The reception venue Sinclair Harbor House was obtained through paperwork claiming Ms. Sinclair personally authorized the transfer. She did not sign that authorization. A murmur moved through the chapel. Gavin took 1 step forward. This isn't the place. The veil Ms. Brielle Sinclair is wearing is the documented property of the Sinclair family estate, designated for the use of Amara Sinclair's as eldest daughter and beneficiary. Its removal from the estate required her written consent. He paused. No consent exists. Brielle had gone very still at the altar. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was staring at a point somewhere above the officiant's head, with the expression of someone who has just realized the floor beneath them is not as solid as it appeared. Gavin turned toward Jae-hyun with something close to fury. You agreed to stand beside me. I said I'd be here. Jae-hyun's voice didn't change. I didn't specify in what capacity. The doors at the back of the chapel opened. A woman in a dark blazer walked in carrying a document folder. Lenora Vance, the Sinclair family attorney, who Amara had not known was coming, who Amara had not known had been called. Lenora walked to the center aisle and stood there with the particular composure of someone who has spent 30 years in rooms where things were falling apart and learned to find it unremarkable. Amara looked at Jae-hyun. He had been Gavin's best man. He had accepted that role, shown up, stood at that altar in that suit, and everyone in the chapel had assumed they understood what that meant, including Amara. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to understand why he'd agreed to it, had finally told herself it was business logic, maintaining a relationship, not taking sides. Some calculation, she didn't have enough information to follow. She'd been wrong about all of it. He hadn't been standing beside Gavin. He'd been standing close enough to Gavin to watch everything. The recognition moved through her slowly, the way understanding sometimes arrives not as a sudden light but as warmth, something that was always present. Only now she could feel it. He had spent the past weeks building a case, staying close, documenting, preserving records before anyone thought to destroy them. And he had waited until the ceremony itself, until the moment where everything was witnessed, until Amara was in the room, before he said a word. He turned to her then, and his voice dropped, not private, but quieter, the room holding its breath to hear it. What do you want? The question landed like a still water. Not what do you need, not what should you do, not what will make this easier for everyone. What do you want? In 32 years, Amara could count on one hand the number of times someone had asked her that question, and actually meant it as a question rather than as a preface to telling her the answer. Her parents had asked it sometimes. But there was always a shape to the silence that followed, a shape that meant the answer had already been decided, and they were waiting to see if she'd find it herself or need to be led there. Jae-hyun was waiting. No shape in his silence, just the question. Amara looked at her sister. Brielle was 28 years old and had grown up in Amara's shadow without ever acknowledging it, without acknowledging that the shadow existed, that she resented it, that the resentment had built into something that could make a person capable of this. She was standing at an altar in a stolen veil, with tears beginning to collect at the corners of her eyes, and I knew her well enough to know that the tears were real. That was the complicated thing about Brielle. The remorse was always real. It just never arrived before the damage. "Take the veil off," Amara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Not hard. Just certain. Brielle's hands went to her head. Her fingers found the pins slowly, the way you move when you're hoping someone will tell you to stop. Nobody told her to stop. She removed the veil and held it in both hands like something she'd broken. And the pearls caught the light, and Amara looked at the imperfect corner, the place where her grandmother's hands had shaken, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. She stood up. "Sinclair Harbor House is closed to this reception." Then she turned to Lenora Vance. "I want a complete forensic review of the wedding accounts. Every transfer, every authorization, every document that carries my name." Lenora opened her folder. Outside, she could hear the first car pulling away. Inside the chapel, nobody was looking at the altar anymore. The stolen wedding had lasted 11 minutes. What came next would take considerably longer to unravel, and what it uncovered would prove to be something far larger, far colder, and far more deliberate than a man who'd simply run away with the wrong woman. Gavin Mercer hadn't panicked, he'd planned, and the plan had been running for a long time before Amara ever sat down in that second row, with her hands flat on her knees and her face perfectly still, waiting for someone to ask her what she wanted. The veil was still in Brielle's hands when the first person stood up. It wasn't Gavin. It wasn't any of the guests. It was one of the groomsmen, a man named Preston, who worked in Gavin's real estate firm and had the particular energy of someone who had spent his entire career deciding which room to be loyal to based on who was winning. Preston stood up, looked around the chapel once, and then walked quietly toward the side exit without making eye contact with anyone. 2 other people followed him within 30 seconds. Not running, just leaving the way people leave a party when they realize it's become a situation. Amara watched them go. She was still standing in the second row with the aisle between her and the altar, and the distance felt different now than it had. When she sat down, not the distance of someone excluded from a celebration, but the distance of someone who had just drawn a line and was waiting to see who crossed it, and in which direction. Sonoritz Vance already moving. She'd opened her folder with the brisk efficiency and was sorting documents of someone who had been ready for this moment and was relieved it had finally arrived. Amara had known Lenora for years. The attorney had managed Sinclair family legal affairs for 2 decades, had known Amara since she was in her teens, and Amara now understood that the careful neutrality Lenora had maintained over the past 3 months had not been indifference. It had been patience. She'd been waiting for the right moment and the right room. Gavin found his voice in a different register than the one he'd used before, lower. Stripped of the performance quality, the voice he used when he was actually angry rather than performing anger. "You don't have standing to do this." He was talking to Jae-hyun, but his eyes kept moving to Lenora's folder. "Whatever she told you, whatever documents you think you have." "I don't think anything." Jae-hyun hadn't moved from where he was standing. He had the quality of a man who understood that stillness was its own form of pressure. "Preservation request was filed with your firm's document management system 10 days ago. You received confirmation. The deletion attempts occurred afterward." The chapel went quieter than it had been before, which was something Amara wouldn't have thought possible. Gavin's jaw moved. He looked at Jae-hyun for a long moment, and something shifted in his face, not collapse, not yet, but the first hairline crack in the structure of a man who had built his confidence on the assumption that other people were slower than him. "That's not what those records show." "Then you'll have no problem with the review." Amara said it without raising her voice. She was looking at him directly, which she hadn't done since she walked into the chapel, had been carefully not doing because she hadn't trusted herself to do it and remained composed. Now she found that looking at him was easier than she'd expected. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, Gavin was built and groomed and had always carried himself like a man who'd rehearsed his own importance. But something about the scale of him had changed. If the records don't show what Jae-hyun says they show, then the review will confirm that. Brielle made a sound, not a word, something below language, a breath that went wrong somewhere in her throat. She was still holding the veil. Her bouquet had fallen at some point and was lying on the chapel floor, with its stems already bending at an angle that meant it wasn't going to recover. She looked at Amara with an expression that Amara recognized from childhood, the look Brielle had always produced when she understood, really understood in her body, not just her brain, that something was beyond salvage. "I didn't know," Brielle said. Her voice was barely holding. "Which part?" Amara's voice was not cruel. It was just precise. "The accounts. The I didn't know about the transfers. He told me you'd agreed to." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He told me you gave permission. For the venue? For all of it. He said you'd spoken to him, and that you wanted the wedding to still happen, that you didn't want all the arrangements to go to waste, that he said it was your idea." She was speaking faster now, the words coming out in the disorganized way of someone trying to outrun their own understanding. "He showed me a message from your email, saying you'd authorized everything." Amara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the chapel's air conditioning. "Show me." "I don't have it." "It was on his phone. He showed me on his—" "Where's your phone?" Brielle blinked. "In my bag. At the back." "Go get it." Gavin stepped forward. Brielle. "Go get it," Amara said again. And something in her voice made the instruction sound like a door closing, and Brielle went. The chapel was approximately 40% empty now. The guests who remained were divided roughly into two categories: people close enough to the Sinclair family to have genuine stake in what happened next. A sound like people connected to Gavin's professional world who were staying because they hadn't yet calculated the cost of being seen leaving. Amara's mother was sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression had traveled some distance from where it had been an hour ago. She didn't look disappointed anymore. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic. Amara's father had not moved from where he'd been standing near the side door since the moment Jae-hyun objected. He was watching Amara with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, and she decided not to try. Gavin lowered his voice. He stepped closer to Amara, not aggressively, but with the deliberateness of a man who believed that proximity was a form of persuasion. "You're making a spectacle. You made a spectacle. I'm making a record, whatever Jae-hyun told you. He told me to get a forensic accountant." She looked at him evenly. That was good advice. Gavin's eye moved to Jae-hyun with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hate, but occupied the territory between them. "This is about him. You know that, right? You think this is about protecting you, but he has—" "If you're about to tell me what he wants," Amara said. "I've already heard that argument, and I didn't find it persuasive. Try something else." Gavin looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. The way a man looks when he realizes the approach he prepared isn't working, and he needs to find the door he hasn't tried yet. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, had found something softer and more dangerous. "Amara, we were together for 3 years. She waited. I know I destroyed that. I know what I did. And I'm not standing here telling you I didn't hurt you, because I did. But what's happening right now, in this room, with those documents?" He paused. "There are explanations for all of it. If you give me an hour without an audience, I can." "No." The word landed clean, and he heard it, really heard it, and the softness in his expression evaporated. Brielle came back from the rear of the chapel, with her phone in her hand and her dress trailing on the floor because she'd never had time to bustle it. She walked past her father, past 3 rows of stunned guests, and stopped in front of Amara. Her hand was shaking slightly as she held the phone out. Amara took it. The message thread was between Brielle and Gavin, dated 9 weeks ago. She scrolled through it, love notes at the top, the breathless shorthand of people in the early stages of something they're trying to believe is inevitable. The kind of text that would have turned Amara's stomach 3 months ago and now just produced a specific flat tiredness. She kept scrolling. Then she found the screenshot. It was an image of a text message, supposedly from Amara's number, sent 3 days after Gavin had left. The message said, "I've thought about it. The arrangements are paid for and most of it is non-refundable anyway. Use the venue and the vendors. I don't want the money to go to waste." Consider it my wedding gift to you both. Amara stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked up. I never sent this, I know. Brielle's voice was very small. I know that now. When did you know? Brielle didn't answer immediately. Her eyes went to Gavin and then away from Gavin, and the trajectory of that glance told Amara everything she needed to know about when Brielle had started to understand and how long she'd spent convincing herself it didn't matter. Recently, Brielle said. How recently? 3 weeks ago, she swallowed. I found a message on his laptop that was different from the screenshot. The metadata was... She stopped, pressed her hand against her collarbone. It was different. Amara handed the phone to Lenora Vance. He showed me this, and I believed him. Brielle's voice was cracking at the edges now, the structural composure giving way. And then when I started to think that maybe it wasn't, I told myself it was too late, that the wedding was already happening, that you would never know. I would have found out. I know. You knew I would find out, and you were hoping it would happen after. Brielle didn't deny it. That was something, Amara thought. Not much, but something. Gavin had taken 2 steps backward at some point during this exchange. He was now standing closer to the altar than to Amara, and his posture had changed in a way that was subtle but readable, the weight slightly back, the angle slightly defensive, the body preparing options. Amara recognized it. She'd watched him do it in negotiations when the other party had more information than he'd anticipated. Jae-hyun recognized it too. He didn't move, but his attention shifted, and Amara had been around him long enough to know that when he went very still, it was because he was tracking something carefully. Gavin said, "Whatever you think you found, those messages don't prove anything about the accounts. One screenshot from Brielle's phone doesn't. It establishes fabrication," Lenora said without looking up from her folder, which is its own category of problem. Gavin turned to her. "You're their attorney. You don't have standing to." "I'm the Foundation's attorney." Lenora's voice was pleasant and completely impassive. "The Sinclair Benevolent Trust is my client. The trust's assets were used to secure this venue and fund portions of this ceremony. That gives me rather significant standing." Someone's phone went off in the chapel. Then another. The sound was jarring the real world, inserting itself into a space that had, for the past 20 minutes, existed slightly outside of ordinary time. 2 of Gavin's remaining associates were looking at their screens with expressions that were trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. One of them, a man named Whitfield, who handled investor relations for Gavin's real estate fund, stood up. He looked at Gavin. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him for a moment, long enough that the looking meant something, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of the pew and left. Gavin watched him go. His jaw was very tight. "What's on their phones?" Amara said. No one answered her immediately. Jae-hyun looked at her, and something in his expression stuffed by a small amount, not apology exactly, more like the look of someone who knows the answer to a question and is deciding how to deliver it. "I filed a notice with the SEC this morning," he said, "regarding irregular use of restricted donor information in investor solicitation materials for Mercer Capital Partners." Air in the chapel changed. Gavin's voice came out very flat. "You filed." "The notice was filed in my capacity as a concerned party who received documentation." Jae-hyun's tone was the same as it had been throughout, factual, unhurried, giving nothing. "The materials contain Amara's name as an advisory board member. She's never held that position." "I'm going to ask you one more time," Gavin started. "Your restricted donor database, the one your firm accessed through Amara's old credentials, was used to contact 16 restricted donors from the Sinclair Pediatric Foundation. They were solicited for a fund she knew nothing about. Using her name, her reputation, her relationships." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "That's the part that will matter most, legally speaking." Gavin looked at Amara. The performance was gone now. Whatever had been constructed in his face over the past 20 minutes, the controlled anger, the strategic softness, the calculation had been replaced by something rawer and less managed. Not remorse. More like a man finally looking at the full scope of something he'd built and realizing it had become larger than he'd planned. "I needed the fund to survive," he said. The housing market was turning, and the investors were pulling back, and I needed credibility I didn't have time to build from scratch. His voice had gone quiet. He was speaking to Amara specifically now, not to the room. Your name means something in this city. The foundation means something. I thought I told myself that when the fund recovered, when the returns came in, you'd understand. That it would have all been worth it? Amara's voice didn't rise. Worth what I would have understood after you'd already done it, without asking me? I knew you'd say no. Yes, she said. I would have. Because you always say no. Because you're careful, and you're cautious, and you never take risks that. Because it wasn't your name to use. She said it simply. No heat in it, just the fact of it, placed in front of him like something he needed to look at. It was mine, and you took it without asking because you assumed eventually I'd forgive you. The way I always did, the way I always have. Gavin looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't wrong about that, he said. Not historically. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 20 minutes, and it landed like something physical, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Amara felt it go in. She let it. No, she said. You weren't. She turned to Lenora. I want everything. Vendor contracts, account transfers, any document with my name on it that I didn't personally sign. Cross-reference with the foundation records and flag, anything that went to Mercer Capital's investor list. She paused. And pull the employment records for anyone who had access to my old digital credentials. I want to know when they were last used, and from where. Lenora was already writing. Brielle had sunk into the nearest pew at some point during this. She was sitting with her wedding dress pooled around her like something that had deflated, holding her phone in both hands, not looking at Gavin. Not looking at anyone. She had the expression of someone watching something from a great distance. Not dissociation exactly, more like the face of someone who has arrived at an understanding they can't unarrive at and are simply waiting for the next thing to happen. Gavin made one more attempt. He turned to Jae-hyun. You did this because you want her. His voice was stripped down to its most basic components. No strategy left in it, just the directness of a man who has run out of alternatives. You've wanted her for years. Everyone in this room knows it. Everyone who's ever watched you two in the same room knows it. You think this makes you the hero? You think destroying my life makes her yours? Jae-hyun looked at him. For a moment he didn't answer, and the silence was the kind that has texture to it, the kind that makes every person in the room hold very slightly still without meaning to. Yes, Jae-hyun said. I've loved her for years. Several people in the chapel exhaled at the same time. And she was engaged to you. His voice was completely even. Her choice, her life, not mine to interfere with. He paused. What I'm standing here for now has nothing to do with what I want. It's about what you took, from her accounts, from her name, from her foundation, from her family. Another pause, shorter. You used her silence as permission. That's not love. That's just very organized theft. Gavin stared at him. Then he laughed. It was a short sound, unpleasant, the laugh of a man who has just been told something he recognizes as true and hates himself for recognizing. You have a criminal organization, Jae-hyun. You run half the illegal freight on Lake Michigan. And you're standing in a chapel delivering a speech about theft. I'm not delivering a speech, Jae-hyun said. I'm answering your question. Amara looked at Jae-hyun. He was already looking at her, and she held his gaze for a moment, long enough to be deliberate, long enough to acknowledge what had just happened in the room and what she understood about it, and then she looked back at Gavin. You're going to want an attorney, she said. Not Lenora. Your own. Gavin's expression hardened. You're not in a position to... The SEC notice has been filed. She kept her voice level. The forensic review is authorized. The document preservation is in place. The fabricated message is on record. She let that sit for one breath. You should call someone. Outside, through the chapel's high windows, Amara could hear the sound of a car pulling up. Then another, not guests leaving. Doors opening and closing with the particular purposeful quality of people who were arriving with a reason. Gavin heard it too. His head turned toward the window. Something moved across his face, not quite panic, but its immediate predecessor, the moment before a man understands, that the timeline he was operating on has collapsed. Lenora looked up from her papers. I took the liberty of alerting the relevant parties this morning. Once the preservation notice was received and then violated, the timeline became accelerated. Gavin looked at Lenora, then at Amara, then at Jae-hyun. He was doing the calculation in real time, visibly, the way a person does when they're trying to find the exit from a room that is slowly running out of exits. Turned to Brielle. Whatever he saw in her face when he looked at her, whatever he was hoping to find there, some remaining loyalty, some last purchase, it wasn't there. Brielle was looking at him the way she had after Amara's phone message appeared on the screen, with the expression of someone who has understood something they cannot ununderstand, sitting very still with the weight of it. Brielle, I have the messages, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. All of them. The ones you sent me about the accounts. The ones where you explained the transfers. She looked up at him. I kept them because I loved you. I'm going to give them to Lenora because I'm terrified of what I've already been part of. Gavin looked at his fiancée in her wedding dress, in the chapel they had built from stolen pieces, and for the first time since the ceremony began, he had nothing to say. The doors at the back of the chapel opened. 2 men in dark suits entered, followed by a woman carrying a briefcase and a second document folder. She scanned the room once with professional efficiency, found Lenora Vance, and walked toward her. Gavin Mercer, standing at the altar of a wedding that no longer existed, watched them come. There was nowhere left to go, not backward to what he'd planned, not forward to what he'd promised, not sideways into any remaining negotiation. And the moment he understood this, something in his posture changed in a way that was very small and very final, the body acknowledging what the mind hadn't fully accepted yet. Amara picked up her bag from the pew where she'd left it 3 hours ago when she arrived for a wedding she hadn't wanted to attend. She walked toward the door. She didn't look back, not from cruelty, not from performance, but because there was nothing behind her anymore that required her attention, and she had spent enough of her life looking backward at people who expected her to wait. Jae-hyun fell into step beside her, not ahead, not guiding, just there, and they walked out of the chapel together into the gray Chicago morning, where the rain had stopped and the lake was visible in the distance, and the air smelled like wet stone, and the particular clean emptiness that comes after something has finally broken the way it needed to. The rain came back an hour after they left the chapel. Shibafara sat in the back of a car she hadn't called, heading toward an office she hadn't planned to visit, watching Chicago slide past the window in streaks of gray and silver. The city looked the same as it always did on a Saturday mornings, the same traffic, the same wet pavement, the same indifferent sky, and the normalcy of it was almost offensive. She'd expected the world to look different after what had happened in that chapel. It didn't. It just looked like Chicago. Jae-hyun was in the front seat. He hadn't suggested they go anywhere specific, simply opened the car door for her when they reached the parking area and said, "Lenora, we'll need you at the foundation office this afternoon. There are records there she can't access remotely." It was practical, and it gave her somewhere to be, and she'd gotten in the car without argument, because standing in the chapel parking lot while investigators processed a crime scene that used to be her wedding was not something she was prepared to do. She looked at the back of his head. He was on the phone, quiet, clipped sentences in a mix of Korean and English that she'd learned over 6 years to interpret in broad strokes. He was managing something. He was always managing something. She had the thought, not for the first time, that she had no real architecture for what Jae-hyun's daily life actually consisted of, that her understanding of him existed in the spaces between his professional life and stopped cleanly at the border. It had never bothered her before. It bothered her now in a way she couldn't fully name. He ended the call. A moment passed. He turned slightly in his seat, not fully, just enough that she could see the line of his jaw. "There's something you should know before we get to Lenora." Amara looked at him. "Tell me." "The digital credentials. Gavin used to access your accounts we traced when they were first activated. It wasn't after the engagement ended." He paused. "It was 14 months before." Car moved through an intersection. The light turned. A woman on the sidewalk was walking a dog, was deeply invested in a particular patch of wet grass. 14 months, Amara said. He'd been running parallel access on your charitable trust accounts for over a year. The investor solicitation modules for Mercer Capital, the ones with your name on them, the first version was drafted 18 months ago. Amara looked out the window. 14 months ago, she and Gavin had been shopping for apartments on the North Shore. She'd been trying to balance 2 capital campaigns and a board transition, and she'd been exhausted in the particular way of someone whose life is very full and mostly good. She remembered thinking, around that time, that she'd found something stable, that the next chapter was going to be quieter. He was accessing the accounts while we were still together, she said. Not a question. Just the fact of it turned over. Yes. While I trusted him. Jae-hyun said nothing. The silence was not empty, it had weight to it, the weight of someone who knows that some things don't require a response. For how long before I knew, she said. Before I knew about Betrayal. First access we can confirm was 16 months before you were engaged. So he stopped, did the arithmetic she was already doing. Roughly 2 years and 8 months. Amara put her hand flat on the car window. The glass was cold. She held it there for a moment, the cold traveling up her palm and into her wrist, and then she took her hand back and put it in her lap. Okay, she said. That was all, she said. Jae-hyun didn't push further. The car kept moving. The Sinclair Foundation's main offices occupied the 4th floor of a building near the Magnificent Mile that smelled like old carpeting and filtered air, and the particular institutional quiet of a place, where serious work happened without much ceremony. Amara had spent more hours in this building than in any other place in Chicago, including her apartment. She knew the names of every employee on every floor. She knew which elevator was slow and which bathroom sink ran cold, no matter what you did to the handle, and which conference room had a window that leaked in hard rain. She knew this building the way she knew her own hands. Walking into it now felt different. Lenora was already there. She'd set up in the main conference room, with 3 banker's boxes open on the table and a laptop connected to the foundation's server. A young man Amara didn't recognize was sitting at the far end of the table, working through a stack of printed records with yellow tabs. Lenora looked up when Amara came in, and her expression was the careful neutral of someone managing very precise information. Sit down, Lenora said. There's more. Amara sat. Jae-hyun stood near the door. The fabricated message on Betrayal's phone is the simplest piece of this, Lenora said. She turned the laptop toward Amara. What Jae-hyun's people found in the access logs is more complicated. Gavin wasn't the only person using your credentials. Amara looked at the screen. A log of access events, timestamps, IP addresses, action types. She was literate enough in this kind of data to read it, and she read it now with the focused attention she brought to everything, moving down the rows. She stopped on a name in the access field. The name was not Gavin's. It was a user account registered to the foundation itself, an internal account. The username was a formatting convention the foundation used for board-adjacent consultants, a temporary access tier that Amara herself had approved as a policy change 18 months ago to make it easier for program advisors to pull reports. The account name was listed as Consult VSM. Amara looked up. VSM, Lenora held her gaze. Vivian St. Martin. The room reorganized itself around Amara in a way that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. Vivienne St. Martin was 61 years old and had been on the Sinclair Foundation board for 11 years. She'd been a close friend of Amara's mother before she became a board member, had given the opening remarks at the foundation's 10th anniversary gala, and had mentored Amara through her first 2 years as foundation director, with a patience and sharpness that Amara had thought of more than once as the best professional education she'd received outside of a classroom. She was also one of 3 board members who had access to the foundation's restricted donor contact list. Amara said, "How many access events?" 47 over 9 months, Lenora said. The last one was 6 weeks ago. What did she access? Donor records, contribution histories, the restricted contact database. Lenora picked a single sheet from the pile beside the laptop and placed it in front of Amara. and your private correspondence files. The ones stored in the Foundation server rather than your personal email. Amara looked at the sheet. The correspondence files contained everything: grant negotiations, board meeting transcripts, personal communications she'd routed through the Foundation server during a period when her personal email had been compromised, and II had asked her to use the institutional server as a temporary measure. She'd done it for about 4 months 2 years ago. She'd never fully transferred everything back. Those files contained her voice. Her actual voice, the way she talked to donors when she wasn't being careful, the argument she'd had with board members, the private assessment she'd written about program outcomes that she wouldn't have shared in any formal report. They contained things she'd said about Gavin. She looked at the access dates. She was pulling these during my engagement, starting about 5 months after you announced it. Yes. Did she know Gavin? Lenora looked at her carefully. They had a business relationship. Vivian's family fund was an early investor in Mercer Capital Partners. Amara sat very still. The young man at the end of the table kept working through his stack of records, yellow tabs, accumulating at a steady rate that suggested the problem was not getting smaller. Jae-hyun hadn't moved from the doorway. Amara looked at him. Did you know about Vivian before today? I suspected an internal access point, he said. I didn't have a confirmed name until Lenora pulled the logs this morning. But you suspected?
Yeah.
How long ago? A beat. 3 weeks. Amara registered that information without visibly reacting, which required some effort. 3 weeks ago, she'd had coffee with Vivienne at a cafe on State Street. Vivienne had asked how she was holding up and listened to the answer with every appearance of genuine concern and said, "You're handling this better than anyone has a right to expect." Amara had felt, briefly, grateful. She was feeding Gavin information from my private files, Amara said. Not a question. Things she knew I wouldn't have shared with him directly. Board discussions, donor relationships, my own words. The solicitation materials for Mercer Capital were remarkably well tailored, Lenora said carefully. They referenced the specific interests and giving histories of 16 foundation donors in a way that would have required access to private records. The public-facing donor information alone wouldn't have been sufficient. He knew what buttons to push because Vivienne told him what buttons existed. That's the working theory, yes. Amara stood up. She walked to the window. Chicago was still there, still gray, still doing what cities do, moving. Indifferent, producing its constant ambient sound. She looked at the skyline for a moment and then looked at her own reflection in the glass instead, which was sharper. She had spent 3 years building a life with Gavin Mercer. She had spent 11 years building a professional relationship with Vivienne St. Martin. The two betrayals were different in texture. Gavin's was personal, visceral, the kind that goes directly to the question of whether you understand anything about your own life. Vivienne's was colder, more calculated. The betrayal of someone who had studied you carefully and used the study against you. Vivienne had sat across from her and listened to her talk about her life with the full knowledge of what she'd already done. She'd offered counsel. She'd offered sympathy. She'd offered the particular wisdom of an older woman who has seen difficulty and survived it. And all of it had been performed from the inside of a crime. Amara turned from the window. "I want to speak to her," she said. Lenora's expression shifted slightly. "Amara, I'm not asking for her to be brought in formally. I'm not asking for a confrontation for its own sake." She kept her voice level. "I want to speak to her before this goes any further. She gets that courtesy." Lenora looked at Jae-hyun. He was looking at Amara with the specific attention he gave to things he was assessing rather than judging. "Alone," Amara added. Jae-hyun said no. Amara looked at him. "Not because you can't handle it," he said, "because you shouldn't have to carry the only record of that conversation." He paused. "I'll stay out of the room, but there will be someone outside and a recording in place." Amara considered arguing. She decided it wasn't worth the time. Fine. Vivienne St. Martin lived in a building on Lakeshore Drive that had the specific quality of old money that doesn't need to announce itself. No ostentatious lobby, no aggressive doorman, Just a quiet building that had been standing in its particular location for 60 years and intended to keep standing there without any input from the current architectural trends. Amara had been here before. She'd been to dinner here twice. She'd met Vivienne's husband, now deceased, and her adult daughter. She'd sat at the dining table and eaten food prepared by a private chef and talked about the foundation with the easy fluency of people who have built something together. The doorman called up. They waited. He nodded. Amara went up alone. Vivienne answered the door herself. She was in a dark blue linen shirt and cream trousers, her silver hair pulled back, and she looked at Amara with an expression that told Amara everything she needed to know about whether Vivienne had been expecting this visit. She had. Her face had been prepared. Amara. Her voice was warm and controlled and gave nothing. Come in. The apartment was the same as Amara remembered. Lake view, floor-to-ceiling windows, books arranged with the intentional carelessness of someone who wanted visitors to understand, and they were read and not decorative. A vase of peonies on the side table, white ones, slightly past their peak, dropping petals at the edges. They sat in the living room. Vivienne poured water from a glass pitcher without being asked, set a glass in front of Amara and held her own, and leaned back slightly in her chair with the posture of a woman settling into a conversation she'd rehearsed. I heard about the ceremony, Vivienne said. I'm glad you weren't alone in that room. Amara looked at her. Consult VSM, the air shifted. Vivienne's hand tightened fractionally on her glass, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for exactly that, and then she set the glass down on the table with a click that was slightly too deliberate. That's a foundation system account, Vivienne said. Registered to your advisory role. 47 access events over 9 months. Donor records, contribution histories, restricted contact data. Amara kept her voice at the same register she'd maintained all morning, not raised, not cold, just precise. And my private correspondence files. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Those records were accessed in my capacity as a board member reviewing Vivienne. Amara said her name the way you'd set something heavy down. Don't. Another silence. Outside, the lake was doing what the lake always did, regardless of what happened on land moving, light shifting on the water, the far horizon, sitting still and vast and completely unconcerned. Vivienne looked at her water glass. She moved it a quarter inch to the left. Then she looked up. My family fund lost $4 million in a real estate collapse in 2019, she said. Her voice had changed, not broken, but stripped of the warmth, the performance quality gone. Gavin came to me with Mercer Capital 2 years ago. He had numbers that worked. He had a strategy that made sense. He needed credibility with a specific donor tier that our foundation had access to. She paused. He offered the family fund a preferential return. First position recovery on the losses. So you gave him access to my files. I gave him access to information that helped him position the fund. She heard herself and something crossed her face. Not shame exactly, more like the expression of someone who has spent time constructing a distinction that has now collapsed under its own weight. You thought he was legitimate. I thought he would become legitimate. She looked up. There's a difference. Is there? Vivienne looked at her steadily. I have known your family for 30 years. I watched you grow up. I helped you build the foundation from a small family charity into something that houses 40 families a month. I would never, she stopped. You accessed my private correspondence, Amara said. Messages I wrote in confidence about people I trusted, and things I believed and choices I was making in my own life. You gave those to a man who used them to manipulate donors and build a fund on my reputation without my knowledge. She held Vivienne's gaze. Whatever you told yourself about the distinction between what you were doing and what Gavin was doing it doesn't hold. No, Vivienne said quietly. It doesn't. The directness of it, the absence of any further justification, the way Vivienne simply agreed was somehow harder to absorb than argument would have been. Amara had prepared for argument. She'd prepared for Vivienne to hold the line on the distinction she'd constructed, to make Amara fight for every inch of the truth. This was different. This was a woman who had already done the accounting and arrived at the number and was simply presenting it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Amara said. "Because you're here. Because you have the logs." She paused. "And because I've been sitting with it long enough that the weight of it has become—" Another pause. "Considerable. Did you know about the fabricated message? The one he sent to Brielle, the one claiming I'd authorized the wedding?" "No." Vivian said it quickly enough that Amara believed her. "I knew he'd explained the wedding to Brielle as consensual. I assumed it was a conversation he'd had with you that you'd agreed to keep private. I didn't," she stopped. "I told myself what was convenient." "You're very good at that." Vivian didn't flinch. "Yes." Amara stood up. "The records will go to the investigators," she said. "Everything, the access logs, the cross-reference with Gavin's solicitation materials, your connection to Mercer Capital. All of it." Vivian nodded. "I know. The board will need to be informed. You'll need to resign before that meeting, or I'll call the vote myself." "I understand." The donors whose information you accessed, 16 of them, were solicited using details that came from my private files. Those donors trusted the foundation. They trusted me specifically. That breach has consequences that go beyond what happened to my accounts or my reputation. Vivian set her water glass down. "What do you need from me to address that?" Amara looked at her. The question was real, not deflection, not an attempt to negotiate the shape of the consequences. Just a woman who had done damage, asking what the damage required. "I don't know yet," Amara said. "I'll let you know." She left. The hallway outside Vivian's apartment was very quiet. Amara stood in it for a moment after the door closed and did something she hadn't permitted herself to do. All day she put her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. Not crying, not breaking down, just 30 seconds of not having to hold her face in place. Then she opened her eyes, straightened, and walked to the elevator. Jae-hyun was waiting in the lobby. He read her face the specific way he always read her face, not intrusively, just accurately, and said nothing, which was the right thing. In the car going back toward the foundation, Amara's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it because she'd been answering every call today on the logic that she'd already absorbed the worst, and whatever came next couldn't be worse. She was wrong about that. The voice on the other end was male, professional, carrying the particular careful neutrality of someone delivering information they know will land badly. He identified himself as a compliance officer at the Illinois Attorney General's office. "Miss Sinclair, I'm reaching out regarding the Mercer Capital Partners matter. We've been reviewing the SEC filing from this morning and cross-referencing with complaints filed over the past 18 months from investors." Amara said, "We have 16 investor complaints in which your name appears as an advisory board member in offering materials. Several of those investors made their initial contributions explicitly citing your involvement as a deciding factor in their confidence in the fund. I was never a board member. I never approved. We understand that, Ms. Sinclair. That's not why I'm calling." A brief pause. "Two of those investors are individuals whose charitable contributions to the Sinclair Benevolent Trust are currently under a matching grant agreement with the City of Chicago. A condition of that agreement requires that trust leadership not be named in any concurrent investment vehicle without disclosure to the city's grant administration office." Amara's grip on the phone tightened. "I wasn't named voluntarily. My name was used without— I understand. But the condition is structural, not intentional. The breach of the disclosure requirement, regardless of whether it was made by you or someone else, may trigger a review of the matching grant. The matching grant was $4 million. It was the single largest source of funding the foundation had received in 5 years. It funded the pediatric housing program directly. 47 families, currently in the foundation's transitional housing program, were in units that existed because of that grant. How long is the review period?" Amara said. "Typically 60 days, during which disbursements under the grant are suspended." Suspended, 60 days, 47 families. Amara pressed her free hand flat against her knee. The cold window trick. Something to press against. "What do I need to file?" she said. "To initiate the explanation of circumstances." A formal response to the review notice, which will be issued in the next 48 hours, supported by documentation, establishing that the naming of your identity in the offering materials was unauthorized. We'll need third-party verification of the timeline of access, ideally from a forensic source. The SEC has the success log, she said, filed this morning. Yes, we'll coordinate with their office. Another pause, slightly longer. Miss Sinclair, the review is a process. It doesn't predetermine the outcome. I want to be clear about that. But during the process, the disbursements are suspended. Yes. Amara ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and looked out at the city through the car window. Jae-hyun was watching her. She could feel it without looking. The matching grant, she said. Not to him specifically. Just to the car. Gavin's name on my credentials triggered a condition in the grant agreement. They're reviewing it. 60 days, disbursements suspended. The families in the program, Jae-hyun said. 47 families. She paused. With children in long-term treatment. She looked at him. Some of those kids are mid-cycle. Chemotherapy protocols. Surgical recovery. The housing keeps them within transit distance of their treatment centers. The program funding pauses. The foundation has reserves for maybe 3 weeks. Jae-hyun was already on his phone. Don't, Amara said. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The car moved through traffic. Someone honked somewhere behind them. If you step in financially, she started. I know, he said. It becomes complicated. It becomes evidence of exactly what Gavin said you wanted. Access. Leverage. A transaction with the foundation dressed up as something else. She shook her head. I can't let you do that. I wasn't going to offer money, he said. I was going to call a logistics contact who can help accelerate the documentation for the AG's office. Get the forensic timeline in front of them faster. He held her gaze. The families need the review to move quickly, not a check. Amara looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. He made the call. She looked out the window. The city slid past. He thought about 47 families and rooms that had arranged for them. Rooms near hospitals. Rooms where children were sleeping off treatments that were trying to save their lives. She thought about the specific administrative cruelty of a situation in which a person who built something to help people could have that thing threatened not by her own actions, but by the criminal use of her identity. She'd sound like green wood splitting. She thought about Vivian St. Martin sitting in her apartment with her prepared face and her family fund and her $4 million in losses, and the precise chain of decisions that had led from that loss to 47 families being at risk of losing their housing. She thought about Gavin standing at the altar in the chapel they'd built from the pieces of her performing confidence with his jaw set at that particular angle. The anger was enormous. She acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a storm, not by going outside and standing in it, but by looking out the window and understanding what it is. It was real. It was completely justified. And if she let it run her right now, it would burn through everything that needed to be rebuilt. She pressed her hand flat on her knee. She breathed. She took out her phone and called the foundation's program director. The call went to voicemail. She left a message that was specific and calm. There was a situation with a grant review. The families were not in immediate crisis. She needed a full census of current program residents with treatment schedules, housing contract terms, and reserve funding projections on her desk by 8 the next morning. She ended the call. She looked at her hands. The woman who had built the Sinclair Foundation on the belief that careful, responsible, transparent work was its own protection had just spent a morning discovering how thoroughly that belief could be violated by people who operated inside its trust. Vivian had been on the board for 11 years. Gavin had been in her life for 3. Both of them had been positioned close enough, long enough, to understand exactly which pieces mattered and how to move them. Could be careful again. She could rebuild the protocols, harden the access controls, revise the board governance policies, install every procedural safeguard that should have been there. But 47 families needed her to be something faster than careful right now. She looked at Jae-hyun. He'd ended his call and was watching the road ahead, not her, giving her the specific privacy of not being observed. I need to change how I do this, she said. He turned. The foundation. The way I run it. The way I trust people inside it. She looked at her hands again. I built it on the assumption that proximity meant something. That people who worked beside me were in it for the same reasons. She paused. I have to rebuild it, as if that's not safe to assume. That's not the same as assuming everyone is bad, Jae-hyun said. No. It's just she searched for the word. It's accurate. About how things work. Yes, he said, it is. Outside, the foundation building came into view. Lenora's car was still in the lot. The lights on the 4th floor were on. The young man with the yellow tabs was probably still working through his stack of records, and the stack was probably not getting smaller. Amara looked at the building. She had spent more hours in it than anywhere else. She had believed in it with a faith that wasn't naive. She'd worked for every outcome it produced, had never assumed things would be easy, had absorbed 10 years of difficulty and setback and funding gaps in board politics, with the steady determination of someone who understood that good work is slow work. But she had never, not once, assumed that the people standing closest to her inside it were anything other than what they presented themselves as. That was the last assumption she'd been carrying, that she could no longer afford. She got out of the car. She walked into the building. She took the stairs, not the elevator 4 flights, the kind of deliberate physical effort that gives the mind something to measure itself against. And when she reached the 4th floor and pushed through the door into the hallway, she already had a list forming in her head, not of grievances but of tasks, not of what had been taken but of what needed to happen next. Lenora looked up when she walked into the conference room. Vivienne, she said. Full cooperation, Amara said. Everything. Lenora nodded once. The nod of a woman who had suspected this and is glad to have it confirmed and is not going to waste time on surprise. I'll draft the resignation request tonight. The AG's office will contact you for the forensic timeline, Amara said. Jae-hyun's contact is going to help accelerate the documentation. I need it in their hands within 24 hours. Understood. And I need a full audit of all consultant-tier access accounts. Everyone. I want to know who has them, what they've accessed, and whether any access event in the last 3 years corresponds to information that appeared in Mercer Capital's materials. That's a significant. I know what it is, Amara said. Do it, anyway. Lenora looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect and might have been relief, and was probably some of both. There's one more thing, Lenora said. Amara stopped. We pulled the original grant agreement for the matching fund. The disclosure condition is real, but there's a clause. Lenora turned the laptop toward her. If the breach of the disclosure condition was caused by identity fraud, specifically unauthorized use of the grantee's identifying credentials by a third party, the review period can be reduced to 15 days with proper documentation, and disbursements can continue under a conditional basis pending the review outcome. Amara read the clause. She read it again. Identity fraud, she said. Using your credentials without authorization to represent you in an investment vehicle constitutes identity fraud under Illinois statute. Lenora's voice was careful and precise. Gavin didn't just steal money from the foundation. He stole your identity. That's a different charge. And it changes the timeline for the families. Amara looked at the clause for a long moment. Then she straightened. The anger was still there, still enormous, still a storm outside the window she was looking through. But she understood something, now that she hadn't understood when she walked into the chapel that morning, wearing her best composure, like armor against a ceremony she'd been expected to endure in silence. She wasn't here to endure it. She was here to dismantle it piece by piece, document by document, authorization by authorization, until every stolen thing had been accounted for, and every person stood inside her silence and used it as permission, understood clearly and permanently that the permission had expired. 47 families were depending on her not to collapse under the weight of this. She pulled out a chair at the conference table and sat down. Walk me through the identity fraud filing, she said to Lenora. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did, and the city was moving through its indifferent Saturday. And somewhere in the building's lower floors, the elevator was operating on its slow schedule. A sound And Jae-hyun was in the lobby making calls that would move things in directions she didn't fully understand, and Brielle was somewhere in the city, sitting with the weight of what she'd handed over. And Gavin Mercer was somewhere with an attorney, figuring out how large the thing he'd built had become. Amara looked at the documents in front of her. She began. The identity fraud filing took 4 hours. Not because the paperwork was complicated. Lenora knew the statute cold, had the language ready, moved through the forms with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment longer than Amara realized. Took 4 hours because every document they filed required cross-referencing against the access logs, and the access logs kept producing new events, new timestamps, new instances of Gavin's activity inside accounts he had no right to touch. Every time Afara thought they'd reached the bottom of it, the young man with the yellow tabs would set another flagged sheet on the pile. By 7 in the evening, the pile was 9 inches tall. Amara's phone had stopped ringing somewhere around the 3rd hour. Not because the calls had stopped, her screen showed 41 missed calls, a number that had an almost abstract quality, like a statistic, rather than a list of people, but because she'd handed the phone to the young man and asked him to log who called and what they wanted, and to tell anyone from the press that she had no statement at this time. He'd looked slightly terrified. She'd told him his name, which she'd learned in hour 2, when she caught herself referring to him internally as the young man, and decided that was unacceptable. His name was Marcus. He was 24 and had been with the foundation for 8 months and had the particular quality of someone who was very good at quiet, difficult work, without requiring acknowledgement. She'd noted that. She noted things like that. Jae-hyun had left around 4 and come back at 6 with food from a Korean place, 3 blocks away, containers of rice, braised short rib, banshan that had survived the transit mostly intact. He'd set it on the end of the conference table, without comment, and gone back to his corner, where he'd been making and receiving calls at a frequency that suggested his own parallel operation was running at full capacity. Amara ate while she worked. Not elegantly. She was reading a flagged document with a chopstick in her other hand, and she caught Lenora watching her, with an expression that was trying not to be fond. "What?" Amara said. "Nothing," Lenora said, and went back to her documents. The identity fraud filing was submitted at 8:47 p.m. The conditional disbursement request went, in 12 minutes later, cross-referencing the fraud statute and the specific grant clause Lenora had found. The AG's office sent an automated confirmation. The human response would come in the morning. Amara sat back in her chair. The conference room was quiet in the aftermath of several hours of concentrated work, the particular quiet of a space that has been used hard and is now resting. Marcus was organizing the flagged documents into categorical stacks. With the careful attention of someone who had understood, somewhere in the past 4 hours, that this work mattered beyond the immediate task. The banshan containers were mostly empty. The lake outside the window was dark now, the city's light catching the water in disconnected fragments. "Go home, Amara," told Marcus. He looked up. "I can stay." "Go home. 8 a.m. tomorrow with census data from the program director." She looked at him. "You did good work today." He gathered his things with the speed of someone who is genuinely tired and has been waiting for permission to acknowledge it. When he left, the room contracted slightly. Just Amara, Lenora, and Jae-hyun, who had ended his last call and was sitting in his chair with his jacket off, for the first time all day, looking at his phone with the focused absence of someone processing information rather than reading. "The AG's contact is expecting the forensic files by 9 a.m., he said, not looking up. "My guy will have the timeline compiled and formatted by 7. "Who is your guy?" Amara said. He looked up. "A forensic data analyst who does work for several of my companies. Legitimate work, admissible in court. Does he know what this is?" "He knows it's a fraud case. He doesn't need more than that." Amara considered this. She had spent the better part of today benefiting from the operational capacity of a man whose operational capacity she didn't fully understand and had deliberately not examined too closely. That was a practical decision, and she knew it, and she also knew it was a decision she'd need to revisit once this was over. A sound like green wood splitting Once the immediate crisis had resolved itself enough that she could think about the longer implications, without the 47 families sitting in the foreground of every calculation. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without qualification. He nodded once, the kind of nod that receives thanks without deflecting it. Lenora packed her briefcase with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been doing this for 30 years and has a system for everything. At the door, she stopped and looked at Amara. "Get some sleep. The next 48 hours are going to require you to be functional." "I know, I mean actual sleep. Not 3 hours on the foundation couch." "I know, Lenora." Lenora left. The conference room was quiet. Amara was still in her chair. The chair she'd sat in for 10 years in this room for board meetings and crisis calls and late-night grant reviews. The armrests had a specific worn spot on the right side where she always put her elbow. She noticed the worn spot now, the way you notice things about a place, when you're not sure how much longer it will be yours. Jae-hyun put his jacket back on. He stood up and walked to the window and stood beside it, not looking at the lake, looking at her. "Say it," Amara said. "Say what? Whatever you've been deciding whether to say for the last 2 hours." He was quiet for a moment. The city made its ambient sound. "The investors who pulled out of Mercer Capital this afternoon," he said. "There were 11 of them. They didn't all leave because of the SEC filing." She looked at him. "What do you mean, some of them received calls?" He met her eyes. "I made some calls." Amara sat very still. "You accelerated the collapse. I made sure certain people had complete information before they made decisions they'd made based on incomplete information." His voice was level. No apology in it. No performance of regret. Just the fact. "That's a version of what you just said." "Yes," she said. "Yes." She held his gaze. Was it legal? The calls were informational. "I shared documented facts with people who had a financial stake in those facts." He paused. Whether they'd hold up in every jurisdiction, under every interpretation, is a question for attorneys. But no one was threatened. No one was coerced. "You moved pieces," she said. "I moved pieces." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the silence had several layers to it, the immediate layer, which was the question of whether she was angry, and the layer underneath, which was the recognition that the version of today where she sat in that chapel and absorbed it all quietly, the version where nobody moved any pieces, was the version where Gavin walked out of that ceremony with everything he'd taken and the confidence to take more. "Don't do that again without telling me first," she said. "All right, I mean it. Not because I'd necessarily say no. Because I need to know what I'm standing next to." He looked at her with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him. "Understood." She stood up. She picked up her bag. Her body registered the day for the first time, the full inventory of it arriving, all at once in the form of a deep structural exhaustion that started somewhere in her lower back and moved upward. She'd been moving on adrenaline for 12 hours. The adrenaline was done. "I'll drive you," he said. "I have my car. You've been awake for 18 hours, and you drove here this morning in the condition you were in. I'll drive you." She started to argue. She stopped. "Fine." The drive to her apartment took 20 minutes. They didn't talk much. The city was quieter now, late Saturday, the specific quiet of a city that has moved into its evening life and is occupied with things other than the kind of day Amara had just had. She watched the streets and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest she could get to rest at this moment. At her building, he pulled over. She reached for the door handle. "Amara," she stopped. "Whatever comes next." He paused. The pauses with Jae-hyun always had content. This one had the content of a man choosing precision over ease. You don't have to navigate it the way you navigated today. Carrying everything alone, because that's the only method you've ever had. She looked at him. "I know that. You know it. You don't always act like you know it." She considered this. "No," she said. "I don't." She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She stood in her apartment for approximately 90 seconds before she sat down on the edge of the bed and was asleep before she'd made a decision about it. The alarm went off at 6. She was already awake. The next 48 hours happened at a pace that was not sustainable and that she sustained anyway because there was no alternative that didn't involve the program families losing their housing, and that alternative was not available to her. The forensic timeline hit the AG's office at 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the deadline Jae-hyun's analyst had set for himself. It was a 37-page document with timestamp precision to the second and cross-referenced footnotes that Lenora described, reading it at her kitchen table at 7 a.m. as the cleanest forensic document I've seen in 20 years of practice. She didn't ask how it was assembled. Some things you don't ask. The AG's office responded to the conditional disbursement request at 10:15 a.m. Monday. Review period reduced to 15 days. Disbursements to continue on conditional basis pending outcome. The program families would not lose their housing. Amara read the email standing in the foundation hallway with her coat still on. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then she took her coat off and went to work. What followed was not a clean victory. It never is when the thing you're recovering from is built into the infrastructure of trust rather than sitting outside it. The board governance audit turned up 3 additional consultant-tier accounts with access anomalies. 2 were explicable with documentation, 1 wasn't, and that one sent Lenora back into the records for another full day. Vivian's resignation was submitted Tuesday morning, accepted by the board Tuesday afternoon, and announced to staff in a memo that described her departure as personal in nature, which was not accurate, but was the version that protected the foundation's donor relationships while the investigation was ongoing. The donor outreach took a week. 16 families who had given to the foundation, based on information that appeared in Mercer Capital's solicitation materials, needed to be called individually and told carefully. A sound like Greenwood splitting that their personal giving histories had been accessed without authorization and that the foundation was implementing new protocols to prevent recurrence. Amara made 11 of those calls herself. Each one was different. Some donors were angry. Some were frightened. 2 were considering legal action against the foundation. One, a man named Harold Osei, who had given to the pediatric program for 7 consecutive years, listened to the entire explanation and then said, "Amara, I gave because of your work, not because of some document a man I've never met sent me. Tell me what you need." She'd had to set the phone down for a moment after that call. Just a moment. On Wednesday, Gavin Mercer was formally charged. The charges were read in a federal courtroom at 2 in the afternoon: wire fraud, identity theft, unauthorized access to financial accounts, tampering with electronic records in response to a preservation notice, and fraudulent use of restricted charitable information in investor solicitation. His attorney entered a not guilty plea with the rehearsed confidence of someone who doesn't believe the plea but understands the process. Amara was not in the courtroom. She'd considered going. She'd decided the work at the foundation was more important than watching Gavin perform his initial response to being charged with crimes he'd committed against her. And that decision had felt correct when she made it and still felt correct, sitting in her office at 2 p.m. reading the notification from Lenora. Brielle called that evening. Amara let it go to voicemail. Then she called back 30 minutes later because she'd made a decision about how she was going to handle Brielle, and the decision required that she not avoid the calls. Brielle answered on the first ring. She sounded like someone who had not slept properly in several days, which was accurate. "I want to give a full statement," Brielle said. "No preamble. Everything. The messages, the timeline, everything I know about. When he showed me the screenshot and when I started to suspect and when I..." Her voice fractured slightly. "Everything. Lenora will be in touch tomorrow," Amara said. "She'll prep you." "I'm not yet, Brielle." She kept her voice even. "Do the statement. Let the process do what it does. After that, we can have a different conversation." A pause.
Okay.
Okay. She ended the call. The weeks that followed had a specific texture that Amara would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't lived inside a crisis like it. A texture of constant movement that felt simultaneously urgent and interminable, like running hard in a direction you believe is correct without being able to see the destination. She worked 12-hour days. She rebuilt the foundation's access governance from scratch, implementing a two-factor verification system for every level of document access and a quarterly of document access that the approved unanimously and that she privately noted would have prevented everything Vivienne had done. She met with the program families not because she owed them an explanation, but because she believed the people whose lives depended on the foundation deserved to see her face rather than a memo. She sat in community rooms in the transitional housing units and answered questions and listened to things that had nothing to do with grant conditions or forensic timelines and everything to do with whether someone was going to keep their child's treatment schedule or spend the next month making impossible calculations. Those meetings were the hardest part of the whole thing, and also the part that kept her moving. Jae-hyun was present through all of it in a way that defied easy description. He was not managing her life. He was not inserting himself into the foundation's operations. He appeared at the margins of things, a message in the morning, checking the AG timeline, a call in the afternoon with a contact who had relevant information, an evening where he showed up at the foundation office with food because he'd correctly calculated that she'd forgotten to eat. He made her laugh once, on a Thursday night in the conference room, by observing that the board governance document she was drafting had 17 subsections and that he'd personally signed criminal agreements with fewer conditions. It wasn't funny, and she laughed anyway, really laughed, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and leaves you briefly lighter than you were before. She noticed that. 3 weeks after the chapel, Gavin's attorney filed a motion challenging the admissibility of the access logs on the grounds that they'd been compiled with the involvement of a private party, specifically Jae-hyun's forensic analyst, whose access to the foundation's server was itself potentially unauthorized. Lenora called Amara at 7 in the morning with this information. Amara sat with her coffee and processed it. Is it going to work? No, Lenora said. The analyst accessed only what we had authorization to provide him. But it will delay things, and Gavin's attorney is going to use the delay to file a parallel motion arguing that Jae-hyun's involvement represents a conflict of interest that taints the prosecution's evidence chain. She paused. They're going to put Jae-hyun on trial alongside Gavin in the court of public opinion, if not in the actual courtroom. They're going to say he orchestrated everything. They're going to say he wanted control of the foundation and used your situation to obtain proximity. Amara set her coffee down. She looked out her apartment window. The lake was doing what it always did. Schedule the press availability, she said. Amara Lenora. Schedule it. The press availability was at the foundation's main entrance at noon on a Thursday. Specific angle of autumn light that hit the building's facade in a way that Amara had never particularly noticed before, but noticed now because she was standing in it and had nothing else to look at while the cameras arranged themselves. There were more cameras than she'd expected. The story had been building for 3 weeks, the wedding objection, the SEC filing, the charges, the Vivienne séance. Martin board resignation and the accumulation of it had attracted the kind of media attention that feeds on unresolved narrative. They wanted the next development. She was going to give them one, though not the one the development motion was designed to produce. She didn't use notes. She'd written notes and decided they'd make her look like she was reading a prepared position rather than stating a fact, and what she needed to state was a fact. I want to address the motion filed yesterday by Mr. Mercer's legal team regarding Kang Jae-hyun's involvement in the forensic review of the Sinclair Foundation's accounts, she said. The motion characterizes that involvement as a conflict of interest. I'm here to provide context. She looked at the cameras. Not at any specific camera, at the general mass of recording equipment, the specific way you address a room rather than an individual. Jae-hyun has been a professional acquaintance of mine for 6 years. During that time, he has never held a financial stake in the foundation, never served on its board, never held any formal role in its operations. He was present at the forensic review as a resource. Specifically, he provided access to a forensic data analyst whose work was conducted entirely within the scope of records the foundation had legal authority to share. She paused. The motion argues that this involvement is suspicious because of the nature of my relationship with Jae-hyun. Someone addressed that directly. Someone at the back shifted. Camera zoomed. Yes, she said. Jae-hyun objected at the ceremony. And yes, he subsequently said publicly that he has loved me for years. Both of those things are true. They are also not the point. She let that land. The point is that the forensic review was initiated by me, authorized by me, and conducted under the supervision of the Foundation's legal counsel. The analyst's work was mine to commission and Lenora Vance's to supervise. Jae-hyun's role was to provide an introduction. The motion is attempting to use my personal life as a legal lever, which is a strategy I'd like to be clear. I find she paused, chose the word, precisely transparent. A reporter near the front started to ask a question. She continued. The families in the Sinclair Foundation's pediatric housing program are in their units. Conditional disbursements are continuing. The forensic evidence is sound and admissible. And the case against Gavin Mercer will proceed on its merits, not on a characterization of who helped me find the evidence of what he did. She looked directly into the nearest camera. That's all I have. She went back inside. The next morning, Gavin's attorney filed a second motion. This one was different in character from the first, less procedural, more personal. It included a declaration from Gavin himself, submitted as a supporting document that made 3 specific claims. That Jae-hyun had approached Gavin 8 months before the wedding with a business proposition involving the Sinclair Foundation's donor relationships. That Gavin had refused, and that the subsequent investigation was Jae-hyun's retaliation for that refusal. Amara read the declaration at her desk. She read it twice. She set it down. She called Jae-hyun. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "Did Gavin approach you 8 months ago with a proposition involving the foundation?" A beat. Not a pause of someone considering whether to answer. A pause of someone who had already decided how to answer and was placing the answer correctly. "No," he said. "Gavin approached me 14 months ago. With a proposition involving the Foundation's restricted donor list and the Mercer Capital investor pool. I told him I wasn't interested. I also told him that if he used the Foundation's resources without authorization, I'd know about it." Amara pressed her hand flat on the desk. "You gave him a warning." "Yes," and he proceeded, "Anyway, yes." "Did you document that conversation?" "I had someone in the room." A pause. "I document most things." She looked at the declaration in front of her. "So his declaration has the meeting, it just has the direction inverted. He's claiming you approached him." "Yes, and you have a witness who will say otherwise." "Yes. Why didn't you tell me about the meeting?" Another beat. This one was different. "Because 14 months ago you were engaged to him. And the information would have..." He stopped. "It would have changed things for you, and the decision about what to do with that information was yours to make, not mine. I didn't have enough documented at that point to bring you something solid. I had a suspicion and a conversation and a decision to watch more carefully." Amara sat with that. A man who had watched someone she trusted begin to build a crime against her, and had not told her because the information wasn't solid enough yet, because he was going to watch and document until he had something that would hold. Could be angry about that. She tested the anger and found it was real, the anger of someone who wanted to have known sooner, who would have wanted the choice. A sound like green wood splitting. But underneath the anger was something else, which was the recognition that he'd been building a case from the moment he suspected, and that the case he built was the reason the charges existed. "Your witness needs to talk to Lenora today," she said. "I'll arrange it, Jae-hyun." She paused. "The next time you have something solid enough to matter, and it involves me, tell me first." No qualification. Just yes. She ended the call. The week that followed was the hardest of the entire process, which was not something she'd predicted. She'd expected the hardest part to be the chapel, or the conference room, or the calls to the donors. Those had been difficult in specific, manageable ways. This was different. This was the phase where the initial momentum of the investigation had stabilized into the slower grind of legal process. And in the slower grind, there was time to feel things she hadn't permitted herself to feel while she was moving. She felt them now. Not all at once, they arrived in fragments, at inconvenient times. In the elevator at the Foundation building, thinking about the veil, the imperfect pearl corner, the way Brielle had held it in both hands. a sound like green wood splitting. In the grocery store, recognizing the orchid variety she'd chosen for the chapel's arrangements, having to stop in front of the refrigerated flower section and stand there for a moment. At 3 in the morning, lying awake with the city's ambient light on the ceiling, running the timeline backward 14 months of Gavin in her accounts, 32 months of Gavin in her life, 6 years of Jae-hyun at the edges of it, watching, patient, careful, never once reaching across the distance she'd maintained. She thought about what it meant, that the person who had been most careful with her autonomy was the person whose professional world was built on things that operated outside the law. That paradox sat with her. She didn't resolve it. She just held it, the way you hold things that don't resolve, because sometimes the point is not resolution, but honest acknowledgement. On a Tuesday 3.5 weeks after the chapel, Gavin Mercer's attorney withdrew the declaration. The witness, a logistics associate of Jae-hyun's, who had been in the room 14 months ago and had kept notes, because Jae-hyun's people kept notes, had submitted a signed deposition to Lenora's office that directly contradicted every factual claim in the document. Gavin's attorney had seen the deposition, done the calculation, and made the professional decision, that proceeding with a declaration he couldn't support was more damaging to his client's credibility than withdrawing it. Amara received the news from Lenora at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. She was standing at the window of the conference room when her phone rang, the same window she'd stood at 3 weeks ago, when she'd first learned about Vivienne. Greenwood splitting, when she'd looked at her own reflection and made the decision to stop operating on the assumption that proximity meant trustworthiness. The lake was different today. The light was doing something particular to it, breaking the surface into 1,000 separate points of reflection, each one moving independently of the others. The whole thing in constant motion, and yet somehow coherent. She stood looking at it while Lenora explained the withdrawal. "What does this mean for the timeline?" Amara said. "The primary evidence chain is clear. No admissibility challenges that will hold. The prosecution is moving toward a plea negotiation." Lenora's voice had a careful quality. "Gavin's attorney contacted the AG's office this morning. He's looking for terms." Amara turned from the window. "What kind of terms?" "Full cooperation on the Vivienne St. Martin matter, full financial restitution to the foundation and the donor pool, and a guilty plea to 3 of the 7 charges." A pause. "In exchange, reduction of the federal charges to state level." 3 of 7, Amara said. "Wire fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized account access. The foundation solicitation charges and the evidence tampering charge would be dropped." She sat down at the conference table, the chair with the worn armrest. She put her elbow in the worn spot. "The foundation charges are the ones that matter most to me," she said. "I know, if those get dropped, the restitution remains. The guilty plea is public record. The conviction impacts his ability to operate in the financial industry." Lenora's voice was careful and precise, the voice of a woman who understands that some decisions are decisions, and some decisions are personal ones, and that only one of those is her domain. But the specific language naming what he did to the foundation and the donors, that language only appears if those charges are part of the plea. Amara sat with this. The financial industry prohibition mattered. The restitution mattered. The public guilty plea mattered. But the charges being dropped meant there was no official, permanent, legal record naming, specifically what Gavin had done to the Sinclair Foundation, to the program, to the donors, to the families, as a distinct and punishable act. It meant the foundation's story was a footnote to a fraud case rather than a named crime. "Tell them no," she said. Lenora paused. "The AG's office has some discretion here, but ultimately, tell them no. 5 of 7 at minimum. The foundation solicitation charges stay in." Her voice was steady. "Those 16 donors gave money based on trust in the foundation. That trust was weaponized. That needs to be named. In the record. Permanently. It extends the process," Lenora said. "And Gavin's attorney may walk away from the negotiation entirely if... Then he goes to trial," Amara said. "And we put 47 families on the stand to explain what the matching grant suspension looked like from their end. We put every donor on the stand. We put the access logs in front of a jury and explain each of the 47 events in Vivienne's account, and we do it in public, in a courtroom. And we make absolutely certain that what Gavin Mercer did to this foundation is not reducible to a line item in a federal fraud case. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," Amara said. She ended the call. She sat at the table in the empty conference room. Marcus would be in at 8 with a program census update. Lenora would be back in the afternoon. The board had a governance review scheduled for Friday that Amara had written every agenda item for personally, in the particular detail of someone who has learned what happens when governance is treated as procedural rather than essential. She sat at the table and she felt the full weight of the past 4 weeks, not as defeat, not as damage, but as mass. The weight of real things that had happened in real time and produced real consequences. The weight of 47 families and 16 donors, and one sister and one man who had stood in a chapel and said 2 words that changed the shape of the morning. The weight of a grandmother's veil with an imperfect corner. The weight of 6 years of distance, and one question asked in the right room at the right time: "What do you want?" She thought about that question. She'd answered it in the chapel. She was still answering it. Every document she filed, every call she made, every governance clause she drafted was an answer to that question, a specific, operational, consequential answer that looked nothing like the romantic version of agency, and everything like what agency actually is: showing up to the work, making the decisions, carrying the weight of them. But the question had a longer answer than that. An answer that went beyond the foundation, beyond the charges, beyond the conference room, with the worn armrest and the window that looked out on a lake that kept moving regardless of what happened on land. She hadn't gotten to that answer yet. She was close. Her phone lit up on the table. "A message from Jae-hyun," Lenora told me. "You held the charges." "Good." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Come to the foundation tomorrow. There's something I want to show you." She set the phone down. Outside the window, the lake was still doing what it always did in motion. Coherent, catching light from 1,000 independent points and making something whole out of it. Amara looked at it and thought about what whole looked like from the inside of something that was still being built, and she thought that the building itself was the answer. That there was no version of whole that arrived fully formed and ready to inhabit, that the only way it ever existed was in the act of making it, daily, with the full knowledge of what it had cost, and the full intention of making the cost mean something. She picked up her pen. She opened the governance document. She began. Jae-hyun arrived at the foundation at 9 the next morning. Amara was already there. She'd been there since 7, which was not unusual, but the quality of her presence was different from the past 4 weeks less siege. More intention. She'd made coffee in the break room rather than the conference room, which was where she'd been living. And she was sitting at her actual desk in her actual office. For the first time since the morning of the chapel, when she'd come in early to collect herself before a wedding she hadn't wanted to attend. The office looked the same. That was always slightly startling, after a period of crisis, the way the physical world maintains itself with complete indifference to what has happened in it. The same framed photographs on the wall, foundation events, program openings. A picture from the pediatric housing dedication 7 years ago, where she was shaking hands with a city council member and smiling in the way you smile when something has finally worked after a very long time of trying. The same slightly overfull bookshelf, the same crack in the plaster above the window that maintenance had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She heard Jae-hyun in the hallway, not his footsteps exactly, more the particular quality of stillness that preceded him, the way a room adjusts its atmosphere slightly before he enters it. He knocked on the open door. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair. He'd sat in it before, years ago, when he'd come to discuss the pediatric housing zoning issue. She'd thought of him as a resource that morning, a contact with useful connections. She'd been grateful and professional, and had never fully registered, until much later, that he'd spent 3 hours in her office for a problem that could have been resolved with a single phone call. She looked at him now across the desk. I want to show you something, she said. She turned the laptop toward him. It was a set of architectural drawings. Preliminary, the kind that still have the quality of possibility rather than commitment lines that suggest rather than finalize, proportions that are being tested rather than confirmed. The drawings showed Sinclair Harbor House, the lakefront estate, rendered in a configuration she hadn't shown anyone yet. The bridal suites, redrawn as family apartments. The formal lounge, reconfigured as a library with low shelving and reading areas sized for children. The ballroom, stripped of its event infrastructure and opened into a large common space with natural light from expanded windows. The service wing, converted into a support center with offices for social workers and medical liaisons. She watched him look at it. He was quiet for a moment, reading the drawings with the focused attention he brought to everything. This is the estate, he said. Yes, you're converting it. I'm proposing the conversion. To the board next Friday. She leaned forward slightly. The matching grant review concludes in 8 days. Based on the fraud documentation, Lenora expects full reinstatement. Combined with the restitution Gavin will pay under any plea arrangement, the foundation will have enough capital to fund the conversion and the first 2 years of operating costs. She paused. I want to use it for families whose children are in long-term treatment, housing them close to their hospitals, support services on site. Not temporary, sustained. A place that belongs to them for the duration of the treatment, not a place they're moving through. Jae-hyun looked at the drawings for another moment. Then he looked up. You've been planning this. I've been thinking about it for a while. She pulled the laptop back. I want to show you because your logistics network has freight operations on the Great Lakes. The estate will need regular supply deliveries, food, medical equipment, linens, cleaning supplies. I'm looking for a logistics partner, a real one, on contract. Paid at market rate. She met his eyes directly. Not a favor. Not a donation. A business arrangement between the Foundation and Mujin Pacific, properly disclosed to the board, properly documented. He looked at her steadily. You're drawing a clear line. I'm drawing a clear line, she said, because I need that line. Because the Foundation needs that line. And because you need it too, whether you've said so or not. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. Yes, he said. All right, I'll send the proposal to your operations team by end of week. She closed the laptop. That's what I wanted to show you. He didn't move to stand up. He sat in the visitor's chair, with his hands rested on his knees, and looked at her in the way he had of looking at things he was taking seriously. Is that the only reason you asked me to come? He said. She held his gaze. No. The word sat in the office air between them. The other reason is harder to make into a proposal, she said. She leaned back in her chair. I've been thinking about the past 6 years. About the way I understood you during those 6 years, which was as a professional contact who occasionally provided useful connections and who I kept at a specific distance because it felt like the appropriate distance. She paused. A sound like green wood splitting, about why the distance felt appropriate, and whether the reason was actually about appropriateness, or whether it was about something else. What do you think now? He said. I think I was afraid of the complication, she said. Not of you specifically. Of the specific complication of being close to someone whose world operates the way yours does. I run a charitable foundation. I need donor trust, city relationships, public credibility. The math on that never seemed to work. She looked at him. I still don't have a resolution to that math. I want to be honest about that. That's fair, he said. It's also true that the person who treated my autonomy with the most consistent respect in the past 3 years has been you. And that's not nothing. It's actually quite a lot. She said it plainly, without the softening she might have applied to it in a different mood. But I'm not going to tell you I've resolved the complications. I haven't. He looked at her for a moment. What do you want to do with the part that isn't resolved? She almost smiled. The specific phrasing of it, the same question he'd asked in the chapel, applied to a different context, with the same absence of pressure. I want to find out, she said, whether it can be resolved. Slowly, without either of us making it into something it's not ready to be yet. Slowly he said, yes. He nodded once. The kind of nod that means agreement without performance. I can do that. She looked at him across the desk in the office she'd built her life around, with the city outside the window and the lake in the distance, and the crack in the plaster that maintenance still hadn't fixed. And something in her chest released the last tension it had been holding, since she sat down in a chapel pew 3 weeks ago, with her hands flat on her knees. Not resolved, not finished, not simple but chosen. Gavin Mercer pleaded guilty 6 weeks later, not to 3 charges. To 5. The negotiation had gone back and forth for 3 weeks with a particular grinding quality that Lenora managed and reported on, with the patience of someone who understood that justice is mostly bureaucratic and occasionally decisive. In the end, Gavin's attorney had done the arithmetic, the witness deposition, directly contradicting the declaration, the forensic timeline that was cleaner than most prosecutors got to work with. Prospect of a jury, hearing from 47 families and 16 donors, and he'd advised his client to accept the terms the AG's office had been holding. Wire fraud, identity theft, unauthorized account access, fraudulent use of restricted charitable information in investor solicitation, tampering with electronic records in response to a preservation notice. All 5 named, all 5 in the public record, all 5 permanent. The plea hearing was on a Tuesday in November, and Amara was in the courtroom for it. Not in the front row, she sat near the back, with Lenora beside her and Marcus on the other side. She'd asked Jae-hyun not to come. This was something she needed to experience without the management his presence would require, without having to be aware of how it looked for him to be there beside her. He'd said all right without argument. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. She'd been in larger conference rooms. The wood paneling had the institutional quality of something installed in the 70s and never quite updated, and the fluorescent lights produced a flatness that made everything look slightly provisional, like a stage set rather than a room where consequential things happened. And yet consequential things happened here every day. The room was indifferent to the weight of what moved through it. Gavin came in with his attorney. He was in a dark suit, thinner than he'd been at the chapel, carrying himself with a diminished version of the performance quality she'd always recognized. The jaw that sets at familiar angle, but less convincingly. Like a habit he hadn't been able to break even when it no longer served any purpose. He didn't look at her. She noticed that. It might have been strategic advice from his attorney, or it might have been the genuine inability to meet the eyes of someone you've wronged in front of a room of witnesses. She didn't try to determine which. The judge read the charges. Gavin's attorney entered the plea, guilty to all 5 counts. The judge set the sentencing date. The whole proceeding took 40 minutes. Outside the courthouse, Amara stood on the steps in the November air and felt the cold move through her coat in a way that was clarifying rather than uncomfortable. Marcus was checking his phone. Lenora was organizing papers in her briefcase with her particular method. That's it, Amara said. Not to anyone, just to the air. For now, Lenora said, which was her way of noting that sentencing would come, and civil proceedings from the defrauded investors were still in progress. And the Vivienne Sands. Martin Matter had its own timeline. The work was not finished. It was never exactly finished. But the specific piece she'd been carrying since a Saturday morning in a chapel, the piece about whether Gavin would be named for what he did, whether the record would reflect the truth of it, that piece was finished. She went back to the foundation. Brielle's cooperation with the investigation had been complete and documented. She'd given the investigators everything: the message thread with Gavin going back 18 months, the timeline of when she'd first suspected the screenshot was fabricated, the specific conversations in which Gavin had used language about Amara that Brielle had, at the time, interpreted as insight and understood only later as intelligence gathering. The investigators had found her account credible and her cooperation material. The DA's office had agreed, in exchange, to reduce Brielle's exposure to a civil judgment, financial restitution to the foundation for the wedding costs, incurred through the fraudulent authorization, and 200 hours of community service with a nonprofit organization of the court's designation. The court designated the Sinclair Foundation's Community Outreach Program. Amara had been notified of this decision by Lenora with a careful neutrality that suggested Lenora understood exactly how that notification would land. She'd sat with it for a day. Then she'd called the program director and asked her to prepare a placement. Betrayal started on a Wednesday in October, 3 weeks before the plea hearing. She showed up at the Foundation's Transitional Housing Support Center at 8 in the morning in a coat Amara didn't recognize. With her hair pulled back and no makeup, carrying a canvas bag and looking like someone who had shed several layers of the identity she'd previously maintained and hadn't yet determined what was underneath. Amara was in the building that morning. She saw Betrayal in the lobby being introduced to the program coordinator. They made eye contact across the lobby space. It was a brief moment. The coordinator was already explaining something, and Betrayal's attention needed to go there. But in the moment, Amara looked at her sister, and Betrayal looked back, and neither of them looked away for first. The look said, "I see you. I know what you did. I know what it cost. I know what you're doing now." That was enough for that morning. Betrayal worked. That was the thing Amara hadn't fully predicted, not that Betrayal would show up. She'd expected that much, but that she'd be good at it. She was patient with the families in a way that surprised the program staff, who had been briefed carefully and minimally on the nature of her service requirement. She remembered details: which families had which treatment schedules, which children were afraid of the elevator, which parents needed extra translation support for the medical liaison meetings. She stayed late twice in her first week without being asked or acknowledged for it. Amara heard these reports from the program coordinator with a complicated feeling she didn't try to simplify. Her sister was a person she would have to figure out how to know again, if she chose to. That process would be slow and partial and would not look like what it had looked like before. Before it had been built on an assumption of safety that the preceding months had made impossible. Whatever came next would be built on something more deliberate and more honest, which was both better and harder. The board approved the Sinclair Harbor Haven conversion in November, 3 days after the plea hearing. The vote was 11-0, which was not something Amara had expected. She'd prepared for debate, had written responses to likely objections about operational scope, liability exposure, the symbolic complications of converting an estate associated with the family's name into a residential facility. She'd prepared for the conversation about Vivienne's absence from the vote, about the governance changes, about the fact that the foundation was undertaking its largest programmatic shift in 10 years in the immediate aftermath of a criminal investigation. The board had looked at her proposal for 40 minutes, asked 7 questions, and voted. Afterward, a board member named Patricia Chen, who had been on the board for 4 years and had a background in hospital administration and almost never spoke in meetings except to ask questions that were better than everyone else's, had stopped Amara in the hallway. The framing was right, Patricia said. It wasn't about the building. It was about what the building could do. She paused. That's always the right argument. Thank you, Amara said. Also, Patricia said, the way you held those charges. The foundation solicitation counts. She looked at Amara with the direct assessment of someone who has measured a great many things in her career. That mattered. Not just legally. People in this organization needed to see that you were going to name what he did, that you weren't going to let it get folded into something else. Amara thought about that conversation for a long time after. The conversion of Sinclair Harbor House began in January. The contractor was a woman named Delia Marsh, who had spent 20 years renovating community spaces in Chicago and who walked through the estate on the first visit making small sounds of professional consideration and then announced that the bones of the building were better than she'd expected, and the timeline was aggressive but achievable. She shook Amara's hand at the end of the walkthrough with the grip of someone who means business in a specific and literal sense. Amara had found herself, the months following the plea, rebuilding things she hadn't known. Needed rebuilding not just the foundation's governance or the donor relationships, but smaller things. Her own daily rhythms, the parts of her life she'd let atrophy while she was in a relationship that had turned out to be built, partly on intelligence gathered without her knowledge. She'd been cooking more, which she hadn't done consistently in years. She'd called 3 friends she'd let drift during the engagement and had 2 of those conversations, if not perfectly, then at least honestly. She and Jae-hyun had dinner twice in October and 3 times in November. Not formal a restaurant once, takeout at the foundation, once when they were both working late, once at her apartment where she cooked badly and he ate it without comment and then produced, from somewhere, a backup order from the Korean place 3 blocks away, which she had found both presumptuous and extremely welcome. She'd told him both things. He'd looked slightly amused, which for Jae-hyun was the equivalent of open laughter. They were finding the shape of it. That was the only way she could describe it, the way 2 people find the specific shape of something that doesn't have a template, that isn't being built from a known plan. It was slower than she'd expected, and more natural than she'd feared, and the complications were real, but they were not, as she'd once believed, insurmountable. They were just complications, the kind that require honesty rather than resolution. She'd told him about Vivian once in December, sitting at her kitchen table, with coffee going cold between them. Not the facts, he knew the facts, but the part underneath the facts. The specific texture of the betrayal from someone she'd admired and learned from. The way it complicated every memory of the mentorship made her examine things she'd believed she understood about herself and where her competence came from. He'd listened without filling the silence. Then he'd said, "The competence was always yours. She reflected it back to you, which is different from creating it." She'd looked at him. "That's a distinction I needed to hear." "I know," he said, simply, like a fact. The sentencing happened in February. Amara sat in the same courtroom in the same seat near the back with Lenora and Marcus. The prosecutor presented the full scope of the harm, not just the financial figures, which were significant, but the program disruption, the donor relationship damage. The 47 families whose housing had been at risk during the grant suspension. The 16 donors whose private giving histories had been used without authorization. Each piece named, each piece in the record. Gavin's attorney presented mitigating factors. Financial pressure, market conditions. A characterization of Gavin as a man who had made desperate decisions in a climate of professional failure, rather than a man who had systematically planned to exploit someone he claimed to have loved. The judge listened to both with the neutral attention of someone who has heard versions of both arguments many times and understands that the space between them is where the actual person usually lives. Before sentencing, Gavin was given the opportunity to address the court. He stood up. He was thinner than he'd been at the plea. He'd had 3 months of knowing what was coming, which changes a person in ways that show in the face. He looked at the judge. He looked at his attorney. And then, for the first time since the chapel, he looked at Amara. She held his gaze. He looked away first. "I made choices," he said. His voice was even, controlled in a way that cost him visible effort. "I told myself at every stage that I was making them, for reasons that were practical. That the fund would recover and the foundation would be repaid, and Amara would eventually understand the math, that at the end would justify the sequence." He paused. "I've spent 3 months not being able to make that argument hold, which is either growth or just what happens when you run out of alternatives." A shorter pause. "I know what I took. I don't have a different way to say that." The judge looked at him for a moment after he sat down. Then she looked at her papers. 14 months, federal minimum security. Full restitution to the Sinclair Foundation, the donor pool, and the defrauded Mercer Capital investors. 5 years of industry prohibition. Complete forfeiture of the Mercer Capital assets. The gavel came down. Amara sat very still for a moment after. Marcus leaned slightly toward her. "You okay?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. Outside the courthouse for the second time in 3 months, she stood on the steps in February, cold that was sharper than November had been, the kind of cold that has intention in it. Lenora was beside her. A reporter called her name from the base of the steps. She looked in that direction for a moment, then looked away. "No statement today," she said to no one in particular. She walked down the steps and along the sidewalk, and didn't stop until the courthouse was behind her. The city moved around her in its ordinary way, foot traffic and car horns, and the compressed breath of people who are cold and trying to get somewhere warmer. She was cold. She walked anyway. Jae-hyun was waiting at the corner, which she hadn't asked him to do, and wasn't surprised to find. Sane, he was in his coat, with his hands in his pockets, watching the street with the patience of someone who is comfortable with waiting and doesn't need to announce it. She stopped beside him. 14 months, she said. I heard, he said. Full restitution, yes. She stood on the corner with the city moving around her and breathed the cold air for a moment. When I was sitting in that courtroom, she said, I kept thinking about what he said in the chapel. When he told you that you only loved me because I needed rescuing. She paused. He said it to hurt both of us. But I've been thinking about what the real answer to it is. What I actually believe. Jae-hyun looked at her. I think the answer is that I don't need rescuing, she said. I never did. I needed documentation. And a forensic analyst and a family attorney and a board vote and a contractor named Delia. She paused. I needed someone to ask me what I wanted and then get out of the way while I answered. He looked at her with the focused attention of a man who doesn't waste that attention on things that don't deserve it. That's accurate, he said. You're not going to tell me you love me again. No, he said. You heard it the first time. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, not the dramatic seismic event of falling, which she'd experienced before, and knew the particular quality of, but something slower and more structural. The feeling of something being built correctly, level by level, on ground that had been tested. She put her hand in his. He looked down at their hands, then up at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The city kept moving. The cold kept doing what cold does in February in Chicago, which is everything it can. They walked. Sinclair Harbor Haven opened on a Tuesday in April. Not a ceremony. Amara had been specific about that. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, no donor reception that would have turned the opening into an event for the people funding it, rather than the people it was for. The first 3 families checked in on a Tuesday morning with their bags and their children, and their exhausted, careful faces. Staff member showed them to their rooms and explained where the kitchen was, and how the medical liaison scheduling worked, and where the children's library was. Amara was in the building. She was in the hallway near the library, reviewing a supply manifest with the logistics coordinator from Mujin Pacific, who handled the foundation's contract. Contract was 3 pages. Standard rate, quarterly review, properly disclosed to the board and documented in the meeting minutes. The logistics coordinator was a woman named Sandra who was extremely competent and had a specific professional manner that Amara respected. She heard the elevator open. She heard the sound of luggage wheels on the hallway floor and a child's voice asking something, a girl's voice. Maybe 8 or 9, and a parent's voice, responding in a tone that was trying to sound like everything was fine. Amara looked up from the manifest. The family was at the end of the hallway, a woman and a man and a child in a yellow coat who was looking around the hallway with the frank curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned to perform composure in difficult situations. The girl's head was covered with a soft cap, the kind Amara recognized from the hospital visits she'd made during the Grant crisis. She was carrying a stuffed animal with the focused grip of a person who has decided what matters to her and is holding on to it. The staff member was showing them to the family apartment. We're listening with the careful attention of people absorbing information they need but don't have the bandwidth to fully process right now. The girl looked down the hallway. She saw Amara. She looked at her for a moment with the direct assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to make eye contact complicated. Amara looked back. The girl pointed at the door beside the library. What's in there? That's the library, Amara said. Can I go in? That's what it's for. The girl looked at her parents. The parents were still listening to the staff member, but the mother nodded slightly, the peripheral awareness of a parent, tracking all points simultaneously. The girl turned back toward Amara, considered for a moment, and then walked down the hallway to the library door and pushed it through. Amara followed her in. The library was painted in a color she'd spent 3 weeks selecting, a warm blue that the designer had called French gray, but Amara had called almost right, until they'd adjusted it twice, and she'd said, "Finally, that one." The shelves were low and accessible and full of books that she'd curated personally with input from hospital child life specialists, librarians, 2 elementary school teachers, and Marcus, who had turned out to have very strong opinions about children's literature that had surprised and pleased her. There were reading chairs sized for children and a window seat overlooking the garden where the lake was visible in the distance. The girl in the yellow coat walked to the nearest shelf and ran her finger along the spines. She pulled one out, looked at the cover, put it back, pulled out another. Amara stood near the door and watched. She thought about the room that had been here before this room, the bridal suite, where Brielle had gotten ready for a wedding built from stolen pieces. She thought about the specific distance between that room and this one, not in physical feet, but in the kind of distance, measured by what happens inside a space, by what a space is made to hold, and what it gives back to the people who move through it. She thought about the veil, where it was now in the cedar box in her apartment, where it had always been, the imperfect pearl corner intact. The girl sat down in one of the children's chairs with a book open on her lap, her stuffed animal balanced on the armrest, her yellow coat still on because she hadn't been here long enough yet to take it off. She read with the concentration of someone who has found something that makes the room around her recede. Amara looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to the hallway and the supply manifest, and Sandra from Mujin Pacific, and the rest of the work. Brielle finished her service hours in late April. She'd done 230 more than required. The program coordinator had mentioned this to Amara without prompting, which meant the coordinator had wanted her to know. Amara had filed it under things to hold without yet knowing what to do with them. On the last day of Brielle's service, Amara was in the building. Sininsin. She'd been there most days since the opening, partly because she was still working out operational details with Delia on 2 of the support center offices that hadn't been finished on time, a sound like green the building, and partly because she'd found that being at work she'd ever had the closest she'd felt to the reason she'd started the foundation in the which had never been about the grant applications or the board governance or the donor cultivation, but about the families. The specific actual families, the children in yellow coats with their stuffed animals and their books. Brielle was in the common room, helping a parent who spoke limited English navigate a form for the medical liaison office. She had her phone out and was using a translation app with patient inefficiency, piecing the form together line by line. The parent was watching her with the wariness of someone who has learned not to take competence for granted and the quiet gratitude of someone who needed help and is getting it. Amara stood in the doorway for a moment. Brielle didn't see her. She was focused on the form. Amara turned and went upstairs. 20 minutes later, she heard a knock on her office doorframe. Brielle was there. She'd returned the form to its proper office, apparently, and had come upstairs with the particular purposefulness of someone who has decided to do something before they lose the resolve to do it. "I'm done," Brielle said. "Today was the last day." "I know," Amara said. Brielle stood in the doorframe without sitting down. She had the look she'd had in the chapel hallway, when she'd removed the veil, the look of someone who understands the weight of what they're holding. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," she said. "I know what that would be. It would be asking you to do something for my benefit that you don't owe me." Amara looked at her. "No," she said, "it wouldn't." She leaned back in her chair. "Forgiveness isn't for you. If it happens, it's because it's better for me to not carry the weight of it." She paused. "I don't know if I'm there yet." Brielle nodded. She looked like she'd expected that answer and had prepared herself for it. "I know that, but I can see what you've been doing here." Amara held her gaze. "I'm not blind to it." Brielle's jaw moved. She was working to keep her face steady and mostly managing it. "Told me you'd forgiven everything," she said. "The message. The wedding. He told me you were. He said you were more resilient than I understood. That you'd be fine." Her voice was very even. I wanted to believe him. "I know. I wanted it to be possible that I could have what I wanted, and you would still be fine." "I know that too." They looked at each other across the office. 32 years and 28 years, and the specific geography of sisters, all the shared history that can't be undone, all the damage that can't be undone either. All the space between those two fixed points where something else might eventually exist. Come back next week, Amara said, not as a service requirement. The family intake program needs a volunteer interpreter for Tuesday appointments. She paused. If you want to. Brielle stood in the doorframe and pressed her lips together and nodded once a nod that was very precise and very controlled and was clearly the outer limit of what she could do without losing composure entirely. I'll be here, she said. She left. Amara sat in her chair for a moment. The chair in her office, not the conference room. The familiar worn spot on the armrest. The crack in the plaster above the window that Delia had fixed during the renovation, that she noticed now in its absence. The way you notice when something that was part of the landscape is simply gone. She looked out the window at the garden below, where the lake was visible past the property line, its spring surface, doing the thing it did with light in April, catching it differently than in winter. The cold gone from the color, the whole thing a shade warmer and more open. She thought about the question Jae-hyun had asked her in the chapel. She'd answered it a dozen times since then, in a dozen forms. In the board vote, in the forensic filing, in the charges she'd held. In the conversation at her desk across from a man she was learning to know slowly and honestly, without the protection of distance and without the false simplicity of immediacy. In this building, in this room, in the decision to replace the ballroom's chandeliers with windows. What do you want? The truest answer she'd found was not an event or a destination. It was a practice. It was the daily act of showing up to the work and making the decisions and carrying the weight of them and being honest about what the weight was. It was the girl in the yellow coat with her book in the chair by the window. It was Brielle at a table with a translation app and a form and someone who needed help. It was 47 families in rooms near their children's hospitals. It was a proposal on a desk. It was a hand offered rather than taken. That was what she wanted. Not because it was simple, because it was hers. In June, Jae-hyun came to the children's library. He came on a Saturday, which was visiting day, the day families were encouraged to bring in siblings, an extended family, the day the library was loudest and most densely populated with people who were trying to be normal for an afternoon in the middle of circumstances that were anything but. He came at Amara's suggestion. She was there every Saturday, and she'd told him, on a Thursday evening, that she wanted him to see it not through her descriptions, but in person. He'd said he'd be there. He was. He arrived at 10, stood just inside the library door and looked at the room, the low shelves, the reading chairs, the window seat, with the lake in the distance, children at various points of engagement with their books and each other, and was quiet for a moment. Amara stood beside him. Well, she said. It's right, he said. He said it, simply. The way he said things he meant, without needing to dress them. It was that enough. They sat in the windows a seat for a while, not next to each other, slightly angled, the way two people sit when they're paying attention to the same thing and also paying attention to each other. A child brought Jae-hyun a book with the uncomplicated boldness of a small person who has decided an adult looks like someone who should read to them. He looked at the book, then at the child, then at Amara. I've read worse contracts, he said. He read the book. The child sat beside him with the satisfied weight of someone who has gotten what they wanted and is making the most of it. Amara watched them for a moment, then looked out at the lake. The lake was doing what it always did. It had no interest in what had happened to bring this room into existence. It had been there before the estate was built, and it would be there long after, moving in its constant way, catching light from 1,000 independent points, and making something coherent out of all of it. She looked at the room, the books, the children, the window. The man reading aloud from a picture book with the careful attention of someone who does nothing carelessly. She'd asked herself, more than once in the past months, whether this was what winning looked like. Whether the word applied. She'd decided it didn't, or that if it did, it wasn't the useful thing to call it. What she had was not a victory. It was a life. A specific, actual, hard-won life, built from the material of what had happened, and the choices she'd made inside it, constructed on ground that had been broken open, and was still slowly, in its own time, becoming solid again. Months later, in November, Jae-hyun proposed in the library on a Saturday evening after the families had gone to dinner, and the building was quiet. He didn't have a ring. He had one of the brass keys the foundation gave, to families checking in a standard key, slightly worn from use, nothing distinguished about it, except what it opened and what that meant. He held it out to her. She looked at the key in his hand for a long moment. "You've been carrying this around," she said. "For a while," he said. "Waiting for what?" "Waiting for you to not need anything," he said. "To just be here, the way you are right now." She looked at him. He looked back. The library was quiet around them. Somewhere in the building, the elevator opened and closed. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did. "I'm not going to tell you this is simple," she said. "No," he said, "it's not. Your world and my world are not the same. I know, and I need the line between them." "Always, yes," he said. "The line stays." She looked at the key. She thought about what it opened, not just the building. The specific, daily, unspectacular act of opening a door and walking through it into something you'd chosen, something difficult and worth it and yours. She took the key. "Not yet," she said. "Not a date. Not now. But," he said. He said it like a complete sentence, like a thing that holds. "But yes," she said, "eventually. When it's time. Yes." He closed his hand around hers over the key. Didn't pull, didn't direct, just held. Outside, the lake moved in the November dark, its surface, catching the light from the city in fragments, each one separate and moving and part of the same whole in constant motion, and yet somehow, from the right distance, coherent. Inside the library, the books stood in their low shelves, and the reading chairs sat empty in the evening, quiet, and the window showed the garden and the water beyond it. And two people stood in the room that had been built from the material of betrayal and choice and daily unglamorous work, and held a brass key that opened a door to a life. Neither of them had planned, and both of them had earned. Amara looked at the window. She looked at the water. She thought, this is what it feels like to be standing in something you built yourself. From the ground up, on ground that had to be broken first. She thought, this is what I wanted. She held the key.